We're in Vavamad Bays, 6b. There's a book there, Robert, yeah. 6b in middle. And the discussion is trying to understand how it is that there are witnesses that tell us of her unfaithfulness. And by doing so, it causes her offering to be burnt. And the reason it's burnt, right, as in it's not offered in the temple, it cannot revert back to its state of ordinary flour because it's already been sanctified by putting it into the holy vessel. And once an offering, this flour that she's offering, the Sotah offering, which is flour based. So this flour offering that she's putting into the Kli Shara, she's putting into the holy vessels. The moment it hits the holy vessels, and that becomes consecrated. And once it's consecrated, it either has two options. Either it's offered on the altar in the proper manner, and if it's rendered invalid, it cannot revert back to mundane use. It is burnt in a special place for which they burn in invalidated offerings. So the question is, the Mishnah had stated that at one point, when witnesses come and tell us that she was intimate, then the offering is burnt because it's invalid. And the question is, what did these witnesses come and tell us? Now, all we know from the Mishnah is that they came and told us she was intimate. Now, if what they're saying is that she was intimate during the moment of seclusion that made her a Psyche to begin with, and in Rav Shesh's view, when there are witnesses out there in the world about what happened behind closed doors, then the entirety of the Sotah is rendered invalid. She isn't a valid Sotah. A Sotah is, in Rav Shesh's view, when nobody anywhere knows anything about what happened behind closed doors except for the two of them. But in this instance, where witnesses come and tell us what happened behind closed doors, then seemingly the Sotah offering was offered under false pretenses, and thus should revert back to regular mundane use rather than be burnt. So how do we justify the fact that witnesses come and tell us about our intimacy and still maintain the Mishnah which says that the offering is burnt? To that we said, yeah, you want to ask me?
Yeah, I just wanted to, just a side note. Okay, if the tumor was put in the vessel under false pretenses, but it's already been consecrated. So let's say we follow Rav Shesh's view. So therefore you have to redeem that to unconsecrated.
Yeah, you'd have to redeem it to unconsecrated because it wasn't consecrated at all. It was only consecrated verbally by my donation to making it.
Right, but there would still have to be a money transfer there?
So there'd have to be a money transfer to redeem it, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So how do we validate then an instance where witnesses come and tell us of our intimacy, and yet the offering was brought under correct circumstances, and therefore the offering is burnt? The offering was placed in the Kli Sharas in the vessel under correct circumstances. So to that we said this very wild hypothetical where she was intimate in the temple proper, after she's been rendered a Sotah, using the correct procedure. And the offering was placed in the holy vessel, thus consecrating it. But before there was a chance to offer it on the altar, she was intimate in the temple, either because she ran off to the bathroom and found someone, or she was intimate with the actual Kohen, which is watching her, but she was intimate in the temple. And therefore, she's no longer a Sotah because now she's intimate. She's just an unfaithful woman. And therefore, she goes through with divorce. And the Sotah water is no reason to drink that or offer it anymore. But nonetheless, the offering was still brought under correct pretenses because she was a valid Sotah before she was intimate with this guy in the temple. This is where we left off.
What's different about that scenario than the first one?
So what's the difference in this scenario, whether the witnesses come and say she was intimate then?
Yeah.
Because if she was intimate then, then the premise of her Sotah is invalid, and if the offering was never valid, never consecrated.
Right, in this case.
But in this case, the fact when she was a Sotah, because the original closed doors we know nothing about.
Oh, that scenario.
That scenario is we ignore it. She doesn't drink any waters because we know she's unfaithful. We just don't know if she's unfaithful at the time when she was behind closed doors, which is why she was a valid Sotah. But now she's intimate with some other guy, and we are aware of this. The marriage is called off. So the whole Sotah is called off. But not because at the time when it was consecrated, it was done under incorrect pretenses. It was done under correct pretenses because she was a valid Sotah. Until she was intimate with this guy in the temple, she was a valid Sotah. And therefore, when they put the flour into that holy vessel, she was a valid Sotah, thus consecrating that flour. But in the interim, after they consecrated the flour under correct pretenses, under correct circumstances, under correct procedure.
So it's just a timing issue between the first instance and the
Timing issue, yeah.
When that flour was placed into the vessel.
Correct. Okay. Now the Gemara gives another way of thinking about this. Okay. Rav Papa Amar, Rav Papa says, La'olam, in reality, kedaminan mi kara. We could say, we don't have to go to such extreme hypotheticals and say that she was intimate in the temple after the flour has been consecrated. We don't have to go to such extremes. We can go with the way we thought to begin with, that these witnesses come and tell us that she was intimate behind closed doors when we thought she was a Sotah. Now, if that's the case, in Rav Shesh's view, the fact that there were witnesses to the event of what happened behind closed doors renders the entire validity of the Sotah off, null and void. And if the Sotah is null and void, seemingly this flour was never properly consecrated. And if it was never properly consecrated, why should it get burnt? It should be redeemed and go to regular mundane use.
That would be similar to a courtroom in a similar situation.
Yeah. Now, Udika Amras typical chulim. Now, as to the effect that we say that the flour should be rendered mundane, why is it rendered mundane? Sorry, why isn't it rendered mundane? Why are we burning it? Seemingly, if witnesses come and tell us that she was intimate behind closed doors, rendering the entire process of the Sotah invalid from the beginning, in Rav Shesh's view. Retroactively undoing the entire Sotah in Rav Shesh's view. If that's the case, why is this flour not being used or for regular mundane purpose? Why is it being burnt? Says the Gemara, you're correct. But we still burn it. Midrabanan. The sages came and say to burn it, which means like this, biblically speaking, from the strict letter of the law, because in Rav Shesh's view, the Sotah is retroactively invalid because there are witnesses. If that's the case, the flour was never properly consecrated. Now, if that's the case, it should not be burnt. It should just be rendered. It should return back to its regular status of mundane flour that could be sold in the market after being redeemed. But nonetheless, the sages came and said, burn the flour. Don't redeem it. Why? Lest people who are observing this say, people who will observe this, who aren't aware of the intricate laws of Rav Shesh's, that when witnesses come and say what happened behind closed door, we render the entire Sotah invalid retroactively. The people watching this only see one thing. They see flour being put into a holy vessel, and then they see it being burnt. Then they see it returning back to mundane use. And that would set a very wrong perception. People lead to big error, because we know the reason why we would take this flour and return it back to its mundane use is because we understand the intricacies of the law, because we looked at Rav Shesh's teaching, and we know that witnesses arrive and tell us what happened behind closed doors or rendered the entirety of the Sotah invalid retroactively, and therefore was never consecrated to begin with. But that's a legal, a legal nuance that it's a tiny window, a little nuance that we are aware of, but the casual observer is not aware of these nuances. And therefore, the casual observer will just see that this flour was put into a holy vessel, and then all of a sudden it's being sold in the market. And therefore, the sages came and said, even though you're right in theory, this thing should go to the market because it was never valid to begin with. But nonetheless, the sages say, burn it so that the observance of it looks like, okay, it looks kosher. Everything that's touched the vessel, either to the temple, either to the altar properly, or burnt, doesn't go back to being mundane flour. Okay. Yeah, it's a very sound, reasonable way of thinking about it. And we don't have to have these wild hypotheticals of women having infidelity in the temple. We don't have to go there.
Yeah, these ivory tower considerations.
Yeah. Okay. Now the Gemara raises another Mishnaic age text, which seems to contradict Rav Sheshes. Again, Rav Sheshes is of the view that if there are witnesses somewhere out there in the world as to what happened behind closed doors, then the entirety of the Sotah is called off. And if that's the case, as we've been just explaining, then as soon as we find out that there are witnesses to what happened behind closed doors, then retroactively everything we've done for the Sotah is invalid. This is the premise of Rav Sheshes, and that's what we're going to challenge now again. Masiv Rav Mari raised the following objection. Again, when the Gemara uses the word Masiv to introduce a question, it means Masiv, Meisvei, same root word. It means we are going to be quoting a source greater than the one speaking. So Rav Sheshes is a sage from the Gemara's era, and we're going to quote a Mishnaic age text. But before we get to the section of the Mishnah that is a challenge to Rav Sheshes, we're going to read through all of the Mishnah, so it teaches us some other law. Rav Mari is quoting a Mishnah to challenge Rav Sheshes' position.
Because the sages sort of agree with it since they made this.
No, well, this is Rav Sheshes' understanding in what the sages did.
Sorry?
It's Rav Sheshes' understanding of what the sages did.
Oh, it's his understanding.
Yeah. In other words, we don't have to read them. Let me just explain Robert's question. Robert was saying that the sages, if the Gemara just told us that the sages enacted this decree that we should burn the flour so as not to give the false impression, right? So it implies that the sages are aware of all of this. So I'm just clarifying that this is Rav Sheshes explaining what the sages did. In other words, all we have from the sages is the Mishnah which says to burn the flour. As to the reasoning, well, we could assume burn it because it was valid, like Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says the presence of witness does not invalidate the Sotah. And if in Rav Yosef's view, as soon as that flour hit the holy vessel, it was rendered consecrated, and the fact that witnesses come later and tell us that what happened earlier doesn't invalidate it, because in Rav Yosef's view, the presence of witness don't invalidate the Sotah. It only invalidates the Sotah from now going forward, doesn't invalidate it retroactively. And therefore, in Rav Yosef's view, it's being burnt on biblical account because it was rendered because the Sotah is called off, even though it was properly consecrated. It's only in Rav Sheshes' view, which says retroactively the Sotah is called off. Now, if retroactively the Sotah is called off, that means the flour was never rendered consecrated. So he has to understand that what the Mishnah says when it says it's burnt is because the sages must have made this decree. We don't know empirically if the sages made such a decree. This is Rav Sheshes learning into what the Mishnah taught. Yeah. Okay, so now Rav Mari quotes another Mishnaic text which challenges Rav Sheshes' position. Rav Sheshes' position being, again, that if witnesses are present, if there are witnesses out there in the world that know what happened behind closed doors, then the entirety of the Sotah is invalid, retroactively as well. Thus meaning that all the steps we've taken for this Sotah are retroactively rendered null and void, and therefore any consecration that was done is invalid, was never consecrated, because retroactively the Sotah is called off. That's Rav Sheshes' position. So the Gemara is now going to challenge that. Rav Mari is challenging that by quoting the following text. So we're going to get to the question towards the end of this text, but the text reads like this. There's a little aleph at the beginning of the line. It's a little less than half, a little below halfway, actually just about halfway. Okay. Nitmeis minchasa. If her mincha, her flour offering, contracted impurity, ad shaloi kitcha bekli, before it has been placed in the vessel. So it became impure. It never became consecrated because it didn't touch the holy vessel yet. But nonetheless, it still has at least a monetary attachment to holiness because she dedicated this flour for the purposes of her Sotah. It never became consecrated at the level where it itself became holy because it didn't touch the holy vessel. And now it's impure. So it cannot be used for the temple. It cannot be used for the Sotah. So what do we do? So it should be treated like every other offering, every other flour that's become impure before it touched the holy vessels and become consecrated. And the tifta is redeemed, and then the flour returns back to its ordinary mundane state, which may be eaten in impurity. There's no law against eating impure bread. Go ahead, we eat impure bread all the time. We do, right? Because most of us are impure and we're all making bread, which makes all the bread impure. So there's no problem with that. It's just a problem if you want to offer in the temple. And because this flour hasn't been consecrated, because it hasn't touched the holy vessel yet, so redeem it. The money will go towards the other site of flour that you'll use. And then this one goes back to its ordinary state of mundane flour.
It's in the temple at this point now.
It's in the temple, but it's not consecrated until it touches the holy vessel. It's the only level of consecration it has here is that the woman has decided to use this for her flour for the Sotah. So it's the monetary value that's now been consecrated to the temple. And therefore, so long as she redeems it with monetary value, then the flour can be used for whatever. Because the flour itself, the actual flour, doesn't become holy until it touches the holy vessel, the temple. Because it hasn't, so she can redeem it and the flour can be used for whatever purpose. Okay. Misha kitchabakli, once it's already touched the holy vessel, now it itself, the flour itself is now holy because it's touched the holy vessels. It's now property of the temple. And now it's become impure. Somehow it's contracted impurity. Then it's to be treated like every other offering that has become impure after consecration. And it gets burnt in that location where all invalid offerings are burnt. It cannot be offered in the temple on the altar because it's impure. It's impure. It cannot revert to mundane use that's already been consecrated on account that it touched the vessel. And therefore, tisarif, it's burnt in a special place that they have in the temple to burn such things.
So this is an argument against Rav Sheshet.
Not yet. Not yet. This is just ordinary law of all offerings.
Okay.
We haven't got to the point where we're challenging Rav Sheshet yet. Okay, now the next step for the Sotah is as follows. Here's the step, just so we understand what exactly is going on. The flour that she brings is put into a special holy vessel, kli shares. Then the kohen does something called kemitza. Kemitza is where the kohen puts his hand and in a certain manner picks up the flour. That's step 2. So step 1 is the flour goes into the holy vessel, the kli shares. Step 2 is kemitza. The kohen takes that handful. Step 3 is the kohen walks towards the altar, and step 4 is he offers it there.
Does he put incense on it? No, not for the Sotah.
Not for the Sotah. Sotah doesn't get incense. Right, so that's the 4 steps. It goes into the vessel, kohen takes a fistful, and then step 3 takes it to the altar, and then step 4 is offers it. The rest of the flour gets eaten by the kohen. The rest of the flour is left behind from whatever he hasn't taken with his fist, right? Because there's much more than a fistful in that bowl, and he only takes a fistful. The rest of it is eaten. Okay, so now, says this Mishnah text, Kiddush HaKoimetz, I'm sorry, I missed the stage. The walking, when the kohen walks the flour that he's taking with the fist to the altar, he does it in another vessel. So he takes the fistful and he puts it in another vessel, and then he brings it to the altar. All right, just to make sure. Look at Rashi again.
That's called kametz.
Kemitza. Kemitza is what he does with his hand, and the next step is halacha, where he walks. Yes. So there's the flour is put into a holy vessel. He then takes the fistful, puts that fistful into another holy vessel, and then takes it to the altar. Okay. So in the same way, the flour in the first time becomes consecrated when it goes into the holy vessel. The kemitza also goes through a second level of consecration by putting it into the next vessel. And now it's been consecrated as the kemitza offering. So first the flour in total is consecrated as the Sotah flowers. And then the fistful is consecrated in the second vessel as the kemitza offering, as the offering that's actually going to be brought to the altar. Because the rest of the flour, again, is eaten by the kohen. So let's see.
The regular mincha offering we're talking about.
All mincha offerings go through this procedure, yes. but also the Sotah, but not just the Sotah. All mincha offerings go through this procedure.
Wouldn't have this, right? Because
She does. Yeah. So kiddush hakometz, if the kometz, meaning the fistful that the kohen has taken from the first vessel, has now been consecrated and put into another vessel, but he didn't have enough time to actually bring it. He put it into the vessel and he's starting to walk towards the altar, but he hasn't made it there yet. And and now the husband died. Oi, or the woman died, the Sotah woman died. Now what does he do? The two levels of consecration happened. The flower has been consecrated in the first one. Then he's taken the fistful, and that fistful has been consecrated in its vessel. And he's about to offer it on their behalf, on this husband and wife, and one of them dies. So it cannot be offered because the person who is supposed to be, the person on whose behalf this offering is being offered is no longer here. And offerings must be offered on those who are living, not on those who are not. So what do we do with this flower? It says the Gemara, this gets the law of any other offering that's been consecrated. It started and it's burnt. Again, for the same reason. It cannot be offered on the altar because the people who are supposed to offer it are no longer here. It cannot return to mundane use because it's already been consecrated in the holy vessels. And therefore, what do? We burn it in a special location for all invalidated offerings. Now go to the next step. The actual fistful was put into the consecrated vessel. It was brought to the altar and it's offered. But now, as I mentioned, the kohen has to go back and eat the rest of the offering. What was left behind in the first bowl? Right? There's the first bowl of flour. He takes the fistful, puts it into another vessel, and offers that on the altar. So he's offered that on the altar, and now he's going to go back to eat the rest of the flour. Normal case. No one died. But now,
how does he eat flour?
How does he what?
How does he eat flour?
Oh, it's baked. Alan asked, how does he eat flour? It's baked in a certain way with oil, and it's baked into like a kind of cake. But each mincha has a different way of baking the cake. More oil, less oil, matzah, not matzah. This one's barley one, actually. There's different ways of baking it, but it's baked into and then eaten. So now, he didn't have time to eat the rest of it. So he did all, the flour is put into the original bowl. He takes the kmitza, he takes the fistful, puts it into a second bowl, offers on the altar. He's going to go back and eat the rest. Now one of them dies.
Dies after the burning?
After the offering on the altar. So every step of the procedure was done correctly because it was offered on behalf of two people who were alive, the husband and wife. But now the last bit, which is him needing to eat the rest, is now they're not here anymore. So says the Mishnah, this is just like every other offering, and he can eat it. Why can he eat it? Because at the moment of offering it, it was offered correctly. This came on a doubt, to begin with. The whole point of why this offering was offered is because we're not sure what happened behind closed doors. And this offering is meant to atone for that mistake. Kipra sveika. So she was atoned for her doubt. There's no sin. We don't know if there's a sin. It's not as if we know of a specific sin that we're offering this offering on behalf of. We're not sure. So at the moment of offering, it atoned for the one who was in doubt. And now she's gone. Fine. But it was still offered all correctly. At the time of offering, it was all offered correctly. Right?
It's true. It's interesting too, when the point of atonement occurs, right? Like usually for a korban, right, it's blood when it's thrown on the altar.
That's correct. So in the
Sotah, maybe it's when she drinks rather
than... No. So there's a good question. So Rashi says that these four stages parallel the four stages that happen by an animal. So the pouring it into the when he takes the fistful, that corresponds to slaughter. That corresponds to the slaughter.
Okay.
When he puts the flour into the second vessel, that is like catching the blood in the vessel after the slaughtering. When he walks with the with the second pan with the flour that he took a fistful to the temple
The fire, right?
and then offers that. That's similar to the kohen who walks with the blood after slaughtering and sprinkles it. So all the stages of the offering has been done before they died. What's left now is to eat the rest of the flour. And therefore the Gemara says, because everything was done properly and she's atoned for the doubt of what might have happened,
Whatever happens after that.
whatever happens, that is fine.
it's
And
fine.
therefore he could eat the rest.
You could eat it.
Okay, he can eat it. Now we come to the point where the Gemara is going to ask the question of Sheshis. So all this was like introductory text. So let's get to the main point of why the Gemara raised this whole statement, which is like as follows. Bola Edim Shehi Tmeya. Witnesses came and told us that she was impure, that she was unfaithful. Now again, we don't know when this is. Right? But we know one thing like this. Let's just see. We're going to have two laws now. One is that if witnesses come and tell us that she was unfaithful, minchasa nisrefes, her offering is burnt. If her offering is burnt, that means when did these witnesses arrive? The witnesses arrived obviously after the flour has been consecrated. It's only burnt after the flour has been rendered holy by coming in contact with the holy vessels. Okay, so we know that for sure. These witnesses tell us that she was intimate, certainly came along after the flour has been consecrated in the holy vessel, and that's why it's burnt. And now comes another law. Right, so at this point, we can still assume that the reason why it's being burnt is not because it's actually invalid, because the presence of the witness is invalidated retroactively, and the only reason why it's being burnt is because the sages enacted a law saying that we don't want flour that has touched that's become consecrated to be sold in the market because it gives a bad impression. Because the casual observer doesn't know the nuance of the law that it was invalidated retroactively. So from this statement alone, there's no question of Sheshis. We can answer it the same way we answered it before. Right? And now comes a new statement from this Mishnah, which is, what if the witnesses who told us the whole story to begin with, there were witnesses who came and told us that she was secluded behind closed doors. That's the whole thing started. He warned her. She's secluded. And witnesses came along and said, we know she's secluded with so-and-so. And that so-and-so is the one that he has been warned about. Now, what if those witnesses are proven to be wrong now? Specifically, through a process called Edim Zomamin. Edim Zomamin means as follows. If two witnesses come to a court and testify about an event, so say in this case, two witnesses are coming and saying, we saw Mrs. So-and-so seclude herself with so-and-so. Now, two other witnesses arrive and tell us, those two witnesses say that they saw Mrs. So-and-so seclude herself on Sunday at 2:00. That cannot be true because Sunday at 2:00, they were having lunch with us. So that's what Edim Zomamin is. Edim Zomamin is when other witnesses arrive and tell us and invalidate the first witnesses because they tell us that the witnesses could not have been present at the time that they said they were present to watch the event because we know they were somewhere else.
And that's usually or always taken
By Torah law, this is taken as true.
second.
The second witness is correct. So now the question is, the whole thing is now certainly invalid. Retroactively now, it's certainly invalid. Because there was never a moment when she was actually legitimate Sotah. The whole thing was false. Because these two witnesses who told us that she secluded herself turned out to be liars. So this is certainly a case of retroactive invalidation. And therefore, what does the Mishnah say? Minchasa chulin. Her mincha, her offering, is rendered regular flour that can be returned for mundane use after redemption. Now the question becomes, if you, Rav Sheshis, have suggested in the last statement we learned earlier today, if you're of the opinion that the sages enacted a law that whenever flour touches the holy vessel, it should be burnt, even if it turns out that retroactively the whole thing was invalid, because we don't want people to have a wrong misimpression. If that's the case, the same thing's here with the Eidim Zaymamin. When these witnesses are found out to be liars, It's true that the Sotah is invalidated retroactively, but nonetheless, the sage's enactment, which say that once flour has been consecrated, it should not return to mundane use because of the observer, should be upheld here too. According to Rav Yesheshes, the presence of witnesses who tell us that they were intimate or finding that the witnesses are liars are equal to invalidate the Sotah retroactively. So be consistent. Either say that in both cases, because it's retroactively invalidated, the flour is now rendered mundane, or be consistent and say that the sages enacted a law that you do not return it to mundane thing because you don't want the casual observer to think that to make a mistake. But why are you splitting? When it's invalidated retroactively by the presence of witnesses, we say burn it. But when it's invalidated retroactively by finding out the witnesses are liars, now we don't burn it. Now we return it to its mundane state. What's going on? It asks the question. This is a challenge in Rav Shesh's position.
Once they put it in the vessel, isn't it like the atonement part? Or what?
No. The atonement part is once it's offered on the altar.
Okay, so when it's offered on the altar, even if
This is not when it's offered on the altar. This is back before it's put on the altar. Before, yeah, I should have made that. I should have corrected that. Yes, before it was put on the altar. So before there's atonement, witnesses come and tell us that the original. What should happen? Rav Shesh's view.
It should retroactively go back, but the sages said, okay, we don't want the appearance of.
That's correct.
So
it should be. So it should be. But the Gemara doesn't say that. But the Mishnah says that it goes to. So like this. There are two ways in which it can be. Let's make it clear. In Rav Yosef's view, there's only one way in which a Sotah can become retroactively invalid. That is, if the witnesses are proven to be liars. If the witnesses turn out to be liars, then retroactively the Sotah is invalid because the witnesses were liars to begin with. The whole thing is off.
Yeah.
And then the offering she put into the holy vessel before it was offered. It's in the holy vessel, become consecrated. It was consecrated under false pretenses because the witnesses were liars. So let that flour go back to mundane use. That's Rav Yosef's view. That's the only option for when retroactive invalidation could happen. If witnesses arrive and tell us that she was intimate, fine, we'll cancel the Sotah going forward, but it doesn't invalidate it retroactively, and therefore that flour which was consecrated is actual legit consecrated flour and thus burnt. That's Rav Yosef's view. But according to Rav Shesh's, there are two ways in which we can retroactively undo the Sotah. Option A is if the witnesses are liars. Okay, retroactively invalid. Option B is if witnesses come and tell us that she was intimate, also the Sotah is called off retroactively. So if that's the case, then both of these laws should be consistent. No matter what, seemingly, the manner in which we retroactively undo the law of the Sotah should have no bearing on what happens to the flour. If retroactively it's undone, then the flour should become regular mundane flour. So why is it that this Mishnah says that when it comes to if they're found out to be liars, then the flour is rendered mundane? But if we retroactively undo it because witnesses come and say she was intimate, now we're saying you have to burn it because of a sage's decree. If the sage's decree, we don't want people to make the mistake because they're going to see flour going to a holy vessel and then they see it's going to mundane thing. Well, the same thing's going to happen if the witnesses are turned out to be liars.
What if they're all liars?
Well, right.
I mean, you get somebody.
Yes, that's true. And
you get somebody who doesn't like this woman and they make up a story about her, and you get the family, maybe, or family members who just want to protect her. And they don't even know, and they're lying too.
That's a good question. How do we know they're all liars? And the truth is that the Gemara has an entire tractate called the Tractate of Makkos, dedicated to just this. Actually, the first chapter certainly discusses how we deal with Edom Zayman. But at this point, we have to accept that this is the law, that when these witnesses come, they are believed to invalidate the first witnesses. How that happens is a very good question, and there's a whole section of the Gemara dedicated to explaining this.
You're saying Zomanim would make it the flour burnable?
No, the Mishnah says here that Zomanim, if the first witnesses are turned out to be liars because they're Zomanim, the flour becomes regular mundane flour. And if the witnesses come and tell us that she was intimate, and Rav Shesh's view that also retroactively invalidates Sotah, then the flour is burnt. Why? We said before the reason why it's burnt is because the sages enacted a decree. Well, then enact the same decree when the witnesses turn out to be liars. If we're concerned about the casual observer,
Why not be consistent?
be consistent. If we're worried about the observer who sees flour go into a holy vessel, and then he sees the flour go to the market, and we're worried about a misunderstanding what's happening here, then be consistent. It doesn't make a difference how that happens, whether that happens because the witnesses are liars, or whether because we found out she was intimate. It makes no difference. So says the Gemara, here's the reason for the inconsistency. Answers the Gemara. And we'll end with this. Eidim Zemim Kamras. Are you comparing this? Are you talking about Eidim Zemim? Witnesses who arrive and say that the first witnesses were liars because they were with us? In that case, we're not worried about people misunderstanding what happened. Why? Because Eidim Zemim Kala Islahu. When witnesses come along and say that the first witnesses were liars, everybody finds out about that. The whole world finds out, oh my gosh, you hear? There was this woman who was dragged into the temple. She was about to be humiliated. And we find out that these two witnesses were liars. They made up a story. They were really having lunch somewhere else, blah, blah, blah. That's the kind of thing that has a whole story. Everybody hears about that. And because everybody hears about that, they're going to know the reason why this flour is being sold in the market is because we all know it was invalid because they made up a story. It's as good as the story of the Sotah itself, exactly. It's more dramatic. But when we have witnesses that say she was intimate, it doesn't seem such an extraordinary thing. We know she was behind closed doors, so we know she's suspicious already. And now they came and said she was actually intimate. Okay, we suspected that to begin with. So it's not such a major dramatic change. It's not a dramatic change to the story. And because it's not a dramatic change to the story, people will not be aware of the nuance that the law was called up retroactively. And if they won't understand why it is we're selling this flour in the market. And therefore the sages come and say, in Rav Shesh's view, burn it. Okay, so this is a little bit of a mind-twisting Gemara, but I hope we got some clarity. And tomorrow, God willing, we're going to wrap up this whole discussion and move on to the next Mishnah, which describes more details of what actually happens. What's the procedure once she's determined as a valid Sotah? What's the procedure? Bring her to the temple and how the whole thing happens. That, God willing, coming tomorrow. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Yeshikoah. Shavua Tov. All the very best to you all. God bless you all. Thank you.
Look good, Judge.
Take care. Thank God.
Okay, bye.
For sure.
Have a good day.
Bye.